light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I wanted to offer some thoughts and reflections on the subject of suicide. I know there are a lot of contrasting opinions out there, and more importantly, a lot of really contrasting experiences. Thankfully, there's an increasing amount of open discussion between those who are struggling with suicidal thoughts as well. Even within that, though, there's a wide range of possible things going on. For some people, it may have to do with particular medications that are affecting their brain chemistry and causing them to have thoughts they wouldn't otherwise have. There's many of which are related to struggling with anger or depression or different sorts of emotions. And so the people may choose to use medicines or pharmaceutical substances to try to affect emotions in order to make things feel more stable. And I think it's important to respect each person's choices for how they choose to respond to their stressors and change and difficulties. The thing I guess I come back to is also looking at life circumstances. That if you actually have something going on in your life that is an oppressive, intolerable circumstance, individually or collectively as a society, we need to provide for others and for ourselves ways to cope with environmental dynamics that are just positively oppressive. I think there is a breaking point for every person, and most people, I guess relatively speaking, most people are never put in a situation where they reach that breaking point, and perhaps that's an expression of divine mercy as well. But everybody has a breaking point, and if we were subjected to a sufficiently oppressive environment, it would make sense that we would get to the point of saying anything, even death, is better than continuing in this circumstance. What that points out to me is that suicide is a state or a place, a state of mind perhaps, of radical disempowerment, where you feel like there is nothing else, that you have no other option, there's no way to deal with whatever is oppressing you. You are so disempowered that there is just no option, nothing you can do. And so as a final act of self-agency, a final act of asserting your individuality and your independence, to say that I will take the action of putting an end to this oppressive pain, whether it's psychological or emotional or whatever it is. What goes along with all of that, to my observation, is a sort of tunnel vision, that when something becomes oppressive, it's important to respond to it in a broad sort of constructive way, because it can get to the point where it creates a sort of tunnel vision where you don't see anything else, and you begin to forget what other options actually do exist. Or the basic fact, I suppose, that if a particular demand is not satisfied, the world is not going to stop turning. The world will go on, and there may be an experience of loss that is unavoidable. There may be some circumstance that cannot be escaped, but there are ways of reframing the circumstances so that you notice the other options that are available. Even someone in prison, I created a number of shows with someone who works with the Department of Corrections, and I said, so for the person who doesn't expect to ever be incarcerated anywhere, how do you make sense of that? And she described how it could become an opportunity for introspection, for spiritual development, even possibly for study of some field or skill or topic area, because in most situations, prisoners do have limited access to books. So there can actually be self-development going on. The thing with being suicidal is that a problem becomes so oppressive that it seems to actually grow in size until you can't see anything else. Suicide among youth and teenagers in the United States, it was long ago was verified as by a Department of Health study of the U.S. government, that fully 30% of teen suicides are somehow tied to issues of orientation. Young people who are finding themselves to be gay or lesbian and can't accept it because of their environment or situation or whatever. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, and the curious thing as I look back on that is that it's as if the world is no bigger than the town in which you live. And at some point, in high school when I got a driver's license, it's like the real world. I mean, yes, I was reading about the world in other places all the years I was growing up. We read about countries in Europe and Africa and Asia, but they were just intellectual constructs in a book. They weren't real. When it becomes real is when you actually go visit them. But because you have this perception of the world being so small, if you find yourself to be a gay or lesbian youth and you don't see anything within that real world, quote unquote, that will answer your situation, it feels like there is no answer. And when the psychological and emotional pain gets to a certain level, you just have to make it stop somehow. What finally occurred to me many years later, and what was wonderfully woven into the movie Milk, about telling the story of Harvey Milk, was this young man who calls him up in California and says, "I'm going to commit suicide." And he tells him, just get on a bus and go to any major city, Chicago, San Francisco, Denver, New York, any major city. Because in each of these cities there would be a fairly recognizable gay and lesbian population. And it's kind of where we come back to saying, referring, I guess, to the term the kindness of strangers. If I had been in that situation myself, and as figured out that I was gay while I was in high school and everything felt so oppressive, no way, I have to kill myself. If I could gather, give away or sell everything that I've got, my stereo, my bicycle, whatever, enough for a one-way bus ticket to San Francisco, for example. Upon arriving in San Francisco and simply asking, where do gay people live? And by stumbling around, finding some gay people and explaining to anyone who would listen that I'm a young gay man from a small town, I was going to kill myself and thought, well, if I'm going to die anyway, why don't I give dropping myself into a major city a chance? I'm not saying this is the answer for everyone. I'm simply saying this is an alternative to suicide that youth growing up in the Midwest may not often think about. That to go someplace where maybe there's an organization called, a chapter of the organization Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, or a gay and lesbian community center of some sort, all sorts of different things, and to simply say, these are my needs, this is where I'm at, if you don't have an answer, then I will continue with my plan to commit suicide. But in every case, I'm 99% sure that there would be alternatives presented. The problem with being suicidal is it creates a kind of tunnel vision where you suddenly don't see all the other options, even ones as basic as, if you're going to die anyway, just walk away. Just walk away from your oppressive environment and find some new place where you can start again. Some new place where there are people, some of whom might actually be compassionate and want to help you. Some of whom will say, yes, you can sleep on my couch tonight. Or I know someone who would like to hire someone for a job just like you. And I know someone who has a room for rent. And I think, this could be the perfect situation for you. The point is, when you're stepping out of the narrow tunnel that suicidal thoughts have placed you in, you open yourself to a universe of possibilities as broad as the horizon. And any one of which, and any one of the hundreds, perhaps thousands of people there, could be the doorway through which an entirely new life begins. Some people have said suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem, but I don't know if that completely answers the struggle at the time, because, of course, at the time, the problem doesn't feel temporary at all. It doesn't feel like it would pass. The tunnel vision basically makes it impossible for you to see anything beyond it, unless you do something to radically change the environment. You know, selling whatever and moving to a whole new location just to see what's there, if nothing else. I mean, if it's gotten to the point where there's nothing left to live for here, the world is a very big place, and there's a lot of other places that may be very happy to welcome you, or at least open to having somebody new show up with a new set of skills and abilities and talents. There may be nonprofits in large cities for whom you could volunteer, and by which you would get to meet other people who are generally oriented to compassion and helping each other. All sorts of different things, but it has to do with showing up for the other options, for the other possibilities. In many circles, there has been way too much judgment about suicide applied, as if it was somehow worse than being killed in a car accident or dying of terminal disease or any other way. The notion that if you kill yourself, somehow that makes you a failure. And I would say, no, it doesn't make you a failure. It makes you a person who was in pain. And maybe it was difficult for you to express that pain. Maybe it was difficult to find someone who would listen, someone to whom you could talk. There are so many cities and towns across the country, though. So many churches and synagogues and mosques, and so many nonprofit organizations oriented around compassion, that until you've exhausted that entire list, you have to keep remembering that somebody at the next place might be the person who will make the necessary difference within your life. Ultimately, in my own life, I began to understand suicide as this place of radical disempowerment, and to also understand how important it was for me to be proactive and to be mindful that when things start getting narrowly focused, and when I start thinking of something as absolutely essential to life, that there really isn't much of anything that is absolutely essential to life. I have a friend who's a rancher in Wyoming. If everything else in the world was horrible and intolerable, I'm fairly certain I could show up at his door and say, "Do you need a ranch hand? You know, feed me and shelter me, and I'll do whatever work you need to be done." But the interesting thing is, as you do those sorts of things, as you develop abilities, as you develop new acquaintances, new friendships, suddenly other possibilities and other options start coming up, doors of opportunity that you might not have encountered any other way, such that one might even say that having suicidal thoughts is the portal by which some people get from their debilitating environments to empowering environments. That those suicidal thoughts might be the thing that convinced them to finally just get up and leave. That all the suffering and oppression simply isn't worth staying there until it really does kill you. That instead, you can go make a new friend. You can find a new employer. You can move to someplace you've never been before. If you have no car, if you have no bus ticket, just start walking. People have walked from one side of this country to the other. It's not impossible. It takes time. But those who have walked from one side of the country to the other, I don't know of a single person who's done it without making a long list of friends along the way. People who could understand what it is to suffer and struggle and not have an answer. What it is to have a sense of powerlessness against an oppressive situation. But by getting out of those situations, even if it's just by walking, to find, lo and behold, there really is a bigger world out there. There are so many other different situations and circumstances, so many other possibilities, even occupations that one would never guess existed. People who, there has to be someone to take care of the lighthouse, for example. There has to be a tour guide for a historic place. There has to be a librarian. There has to be people who work on ranches and farms. Everywhere there is any example of human life happening, there are jobs to be done. Some of them that you will never find in any vocational guidebook, any vocational list. People who run messages and packages back and forth between hospitals and pharmacies. All sorts of very, very unique sorts of occupations. A dispatcher for an ambulance service. I mean, any number of things that are not the commonly, doctor, lawyer, banker, etc. There are as many different kinds of jobs, really, as there are people. And within the more established occupations, there are many different ways to do particular jobs as there are people. There is not only one kind of banker, only one kind of business manager, only one kind of veterinarian. Every single one is different and approaches their work differently, and approaches their relationships with their clients, their people. For a veterinarian, the animals with which they work, they approach them differently and uniquely, bringing their own internal sensitivities and qualities to that. Somebody who has ever experienced suicidal thoughts knows what life means, knows the value of and beauty of life, knows that there is something worth living for. And these may sound like grandiose statements that, well, no, they're feeling suicidal. How do you know they believe in life? Because they didn't do it. That alone tells me that they know something somewhere deep inside that dissuaded them from pursuing that choice. Because they have that kind of sensitivity and knowledge, they may be the ideal person to talk to the person who is still looking for a sense of purpose. The problem, one of society's major problems around this subject, I guess, is just the very mention of the word suicide, and everyone seems to start to overreact. Because I understand it as a state of radical disempowerment, where the first thing they need is to begin to believe in their own ability and their own self-agency. My thought in responding to suicide is to look for avenues of self-empowerment. This does not take into consideration, obviously, those who are feeling suicidal because of chemical substances that have been added to their brains. If someone was having trouble dealing with depression because the circumstances in which they lived were in fact depressing, and what they needed was a new environment, but instead what they got was a prescription, and they were taking these chemicals that were then having this effect on their brain so that they weren't thinking clearly. Dealing with suicide is kind of like trying to deal with someone who's intoxicated, or they're not thinking in their right mind, not because they disagree with this, not because they have a different opinion on the subject, not because they feel badly about some circumstance in their life, but they're not thinking correctly because they have a chemical in their brain that doesn't belong there. Too much alcohol, too much of a pharmaceutical or a narcotic drug of some sort. If we can bring ourselves to a point of clarity in our minds and bodies, to where we know that it is us doing the thinking, it is not just a reaction to an oppressive circumstances, but it's us doing the thinking, and we are making a list of what doesn't work and what are our options, and maybe we can't think of any initially, but there's always the option of just walk away and go somewhere else. And, well, so-and-so will be upset with that. Well, okay, they'll be upset, but they'd be even more upset if you followed through with suicide. So it's not like, I suppose in a sense, being suicidal is like having nothing left to lose. That creates the opportunity by which you can step out of everything that feels oppressive and move in a new direction while you still have life with which to work, while you still have that lump of clay on the potter's wheel to shape in any way you want, to say, I don't like this influence, I don't like this potter wheel, it's off balance, I'm taking my clay with me and I'm going to a new potter's wheel and moving somewhere else where you can shape it in a different way. Or maybe you're not even using a potter's wheel, maybe you want to shape it with your hands one little bit at a time. The point being that as long as you still have the clay in your hands, you still have the ability to shape it. And if everything around you is oppressive, you can take your raw material and go somewhere else. If we can't even talk about those sorts of responses, though, it's as if the environment around us has barred every exit and not allowed us to leave. It's like we've been locked in and we have no self-agency. As much as I understand that there are people responding to pharmaceuticals who are not thinking clearly because of the drugs and the pharmaceuticals, there are other people who are in oppressive circumstances who need to be able to leave, and simply locking them up somewhere where they have no voice in their own life direction, to me, only adds to the oppression. And I'm probably pissing off a lot of psychiatric people by saying that. And I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatric professional, but I am someone who at earlier times in his life was very much looking down the throat of being suicidal, because there was no place in the world for me. Part of my answer was to become Sister Who. The question really is, what will your answer be? If you ever find yourself at a breaking point, if you ever find yourself in a totally intolerable situation, what will your answer be? The option will probably be there of using pharmaceuticals to repress different feelings, to alter the chemistry of the brain, and so forth. I leave that to the psychiatrists and the individuals to decide if that's a correct path to go. I knew it wasn't the path for me. I wanted to deal honestly instead with what was going on in my life, with how my environment was or was not working for me, with how my choices were or were not working for me. And if there were people who wanted to deny me the ability to make my own choices, by doing so, they became part of the oppression. For myself, I needed ways to make my choices, and I needed to be empowered to make choices that could actually be respected. I needed to be able to make choices that were truly good for me, and not just choices that would attempt to remake me into the embodiment of somebody's fantasy or somebody else's expectations. I mean, it would be similar to saying, if someone were to put a gun to my head and say, if you will just do as I tell you, I will let you live. And I would respond, but you're not letting me live. You're killing that which is really me. You're killing my soul and wanting me to become the robot of your expectations, the automaton that has no soul, but acts and thinks and dresses the way you think I should. But I was not born to be the embodiment of somebody else's expectations and fantasies. I was born to be me, and I was given something very unique and wonderful to contribute to the world. But there may only be one particular environment in which that wonderful something can come out. I don't know, for example, if the acrobats in Cirque du Soleil, this incredible, now successful acrobatic and circus kind of performance entity. I mean, there's nothing like Cirque du Soleil. They're doing fantastic things with costumes and acrobatics and things that were not envisioned by anyone anywhere before Cirque du Soleil existed. And at the time they finally made their breakthrough, they weren't sure they were going to. I mean, they basically put everything they had into it, and they didn't even have bus fare home if they didn't succeed. Thankfully, at that moment, somebody noticed how wonderful and how incredible and how unique they were, and it's been going great gangbusters, just absolutely fantastically ever since. It is possible for every single person watching this that there is something even more fantastic than Cirque du Soleil or Barnum and Bailey Ringling Brothers Circus or a night at the Oscars or whatever you want to name as the most incredible thing that anyone could do or become or accomplish. That potential lies within every single one of us. The point about being suicidal is when it becomes difficult to see that magic within us, when it becomes difficult to see that little divine spark, that if we just find the right place to give it a chance. You know, if Cirque du Soleil had decided that they wanted to open in, Oklahoma City or Little Rock, Arkansas, or Lord knows where. These are wonderful places in and of themselves, I'm sure, but it's not the ideal place to launch something as creative and avant-garde and innovative as Cirque du Soleil was. I once heard of a well-educated woman who had been back and forth to Africa and marveled at how beautiful their carvings and their tapestries and such were. At that point in time, however, she was living in a small town in Wyoming and attempted to open an African import store. Obviously, it didn't go over too well. That wasn't an ideal place to put an African import store. There's a synchronicity that has to happen in all of our lives. And when it doesn't happen and we feel trapped and it becomes a tunnel vision where there doesn't seem to be any option, suicidal thoughts may arise. Suicidal thoughts doesn't mean we're supposed to end anything. It means what we need is a new opportunity, a new direction, a new option, a new way of believing in ourselves and our ability to make something good out of our lives. So, if the thoughts ever come, it's a wake-up call. The best thing you can do is wake up to all the other options. And sometimes that requires drastic change. But birth itself is perhaps one of the most drastic changes any of us will ever go through. And we all survive that. Believe in yourself. Hang on and get through it. Thank you very much for watching. I hope my comments during the last half hour have been helpful to you.